Okay. Welcome everyone to today's session. It is the November 17th session, and it's our discussion on reflexivity or objectivity and how to validate knowledge in a time of fake news. Our presenters are today here are Kevin Naimi and Zoltan Lakatos in collaboration with Melody Devries, who could not come here this morning, but she's just really busy, but she did send her part and collaborated with Kevin and Zoltan to have the discussion today. I am very excited to start. It's our first International School of Radical Relationism session proper in discussions and towards building the project that includes book and we will start building resources, etc. And before we start, and to start us in a good way, I wanted to acknowledge that I am speaking from the unceded, never surrender territory of the Secwepemc people, the Kamloops, the Secwepemc, specifically in Secwepemc, and just to express so much gratitude to the original stewards of this land in which my colleagues and I and my students, we all work and live and learn while we remember so important to work towards decolonizing and being very aware of the violence of colonial order and institutions within which we live. And this project is part of an effort towards that that work. And so we have our two presenters here. I think, Kevin, you're going to start. So please take it away. And I understand you're going to share some slides, right?
Yeah, so thank you, Monica, and welcome everyone. So today, the way that we are going to structure this, we're three discussants, and so we each prepared. We aimed for about 5 minutes of material, and so given that Melody couldn't be here, I'll be presenting. I don't know her work, so she's shared some slides, and I will be sort of walking through the slides with the group, and it's just sort of touching on some of her work, some of the questions that this subject for today prompted in her thinking. And then Zoltan will follow up, and then I will conclude with a more general reflection coming from my own interests. And so the subject today is the idea of objectivity and reflexivity and how to judge knowledge in an era of fake news. And so I think that the question that there is a lot in this theme that Zoltan, Melody, and myself, we each sort of enter on this question in different ways, which will be ultimately a good thing for this discussion, because I think having different angles on what this means. So I'm going to start right now with maybe sharing Melody's slides, if they are. Is this you can see the slides well? Yeah. Okay. And so we'll go into full screen. Okay. Yeah. Good. And so Melody's prepared comments today are looking at some of the key elements of her work, and how the question of relationality and contradiction enter into the work that she's doing. And as we'll, in the part that I'm going to sort of conclude with, there are really a lot of points of convergence, and also how I was thinking about what we're doing today. And so so her question is really in the landscape of the far right and fake news, looking at different subcultures. So her subject is digital far right conspiracy studies, and so in work, she's doing what she calls a relational digital ethnography. So the mainstream tendency to follow or rely upon ideas of politics of us and them. And from what I understand, her work takes place in what she calls the trad right sub-community in the United States. It's very much based in conspiratorial types of movements, and also thinking about doing relational ethnography in such communities. So I can't speak for this aspect of Melody's work, and I'm sure that at some point Melody will share much more detail about what she's doing. But so in terms of how it sort of positions us in this topic today, she has lots of things I think that come to mind. So in the work that she does, there's always that question of how do we position ourselves? Mid-liberal mainstream public. There's always this idea of logical coherence, and then the us and them. The them in this case is conspiratorial or far right, and incoherent, illogical, naive. And this is definitely going to connect very close. I think that when we talk about questions of objectivity, we inherently are deploying models that create orderly and disorderly, organized and disorganized. There's all kinds of things that come from, I think, the objective-subjective dichotomy that end up putting us in a position where we end up being stuck by our analogy in some respects. And so the work that she does is looking at the idea of relationality and contradiction. And I really appreciated this. I can't speak perfectly about how she takes this, but for the way that I understand it, I find it to be a very rich way of approaching this question. So when we have this sort of structure of us, them, objective, subjective, and we treat them as being subjectively contradictory, and I think that what ends up happening is we end up creating a situation where we erase, we eliminate, we remove, we take out the voices of those that do not conform to our view of what should be right, rational, truth, all of those kinds of things. And in her work, I think this is one of those, so she talks about relationality and contradiction, and how can we use that space between those two in a productive way? How do we put the dialectical, how do we put it in the conversation? So how do we open up a space for understanding that takes place not as an elimination or removing different people from the conversation? And I'll read this part here. So as anti-fascist relational scholars, we are poised to use what the liberal public perceives as contradictions or tensions, so sources of their wrongness, as a launching point for investigation of those relational material processes that reproduce conspiratorial effects and far-right sensibilities. And I think what she means here is simply that there is in the relational point of view, there is a responsibility to not eliminate, to not erase, to not reject out of hand those that we consider rational and irrational. And I think in the last part, the part that I'll be presenting, I'm going to sort of tie into this idea of how we construct binaries around right and wrong, good and bad, and how that ends up being central to how objectivity works as a cultural phenomenon, as a cultural process, as a relationship, and so I think that, at least for the way that Melody is approaching it here, this sort of tension between these ideas is something that's very fundamental to the work that she does. And these moments of tension can be very productive for understanding, for thinking, for theorizing. And then she says, conspiracies and irrational or contradictory politics become compelling to adherents not as abstract presuppositions, but through embodied interactions. And so this, to me, the way that I read what she's saying here is that there's very much like people think what they think, not because because of being contradictory, because they're being irrational, but because they have concrete, real lived experiences, material relations, so poverty, digital media, alienation, that drive them down a path. And I think that there's something in this thinking too around relational theory where it brings us to thinking about the pathways that people take, the relations that we have with the world, and at least the way that Melody is addressing it here, I think it ends up bringing us to a place also of how can we think in unison with people in their lived reality. I think that this is how she's sort of framing this idea. So relational processes of political becoming are important in the way that she's framing what she's speaking about here. And I think, and Zoltan will be talking more specifically about the concept of fake news in the next section. But I think that this idea of how we take people from their relational processes of political becoming are very, very important for how we understand the problems of our time, whose voice counts in the, whatever we might call it. We might call it the democratic debate or the democratic space. And then she sort of concludes here with this idea of conflicts are repeatedly resolved, lived with in such a way that represents the continual reestablishment of different ways of being, different ways of life. And so there's a kind of creativity in this process of conflict. And this is an example from her work, which I can speak less to, but maybe we can go through together. Contradiction as productive tension. So work makes you free, subjugation makes you happy. This is the specific example from the actual work that she does. So Tradwife belief that submission into hierarchy and gendered labor makes one happier or freer. And so this is sort of an example of the kinds of things that the research population she works with is thinking and doing. Tradwife's recurrent interactions with disembodied tension, with the feeling of looking for happiness and self-subjugation, affords creative strategies that maintain the felt coherence of such a life. So there's a lot of I would say there's a very compassionate take on understanding the situation of her participants, and I think that compassion, in some respects, is very much a tenet of how we need to think about social research from a relational point of view. How do we give the benefit of the doubt to participants to not turn them into simply irrational, inconsistent, incoherent, and therefore erasable figures in our culture and in our discourse? And I think that her work does this. And so she has some questions for discussion, but I think that those questions are probably best for the final part. Maybe we can come back to these questions. So how can we use these concepts of productive tension within relational studies? And how can we apply these kinds of thinkings to fake news? So maybe we come back to that after Zoltan and the final part here. So Zoltan, I open it up to you.
Okay, so can you hear me? Okay, I'm going to share my slides. There it is. Share screen. And I also need the sharing the audio because I have a clip from a press conference by Israel's president a couple of weeks ago. So share. Select the window to share, whiteboard. Okay. Can you see it, my slides? Okay, so here we go. Now for terminological clarity, misinformation is false information and disinformation is misinformation with an intent to cause harm. This distinction is important because a lot of the harm produced by false narratives stems not from willful distortions, but from misinformation produced on the basis of what media critics call built-in assumptions or embodied interactions, if you like to refer to Melody's insight. Now, jumping to the next slide. Disinformation is as old as humanity. What's new, however, is Western media's preoccupation with disinformation and the related industry of so-called disinformation experts. This includes lecturing the public, but also, I would say, increasingly, by building a censorship regime, what its most vocal critics call the censorship industrial complex, or CIC. And, the CIC is predicated on the idea that the public's exposure to disinformation is likely to cause harm on such a scale that some degree of censorship is needed from now on. Now, Contrast this idea with Western elites' optimism or even euphoria in the 1990s when the internet was new. Back then, they used to celebrate the openness of the digital infrastructure under the banner of free speech. And interestingly, today there's a tendency to see that openness as a liability. Now, for an illustration, consider public discourses on populism, quote unquote. For years, much of Western media has attributed the rise of populism to foreign interference, especially by the Russian government. The assumption being that Russia was behind tectonic shifts in Western politics, such as the British electorate's vote in favor of Brexit, or the election of Donald Trump in the US. These allegations have been debunked by legal and journalistic investigations. Nonetheless, the dominant narrative, especially in mainstream left-leaning and liberal media, continues to promote this nonsense. The upshot is that the current disinformation rhetoric and the efforts to build a censorship regime come into existence at a point where Western elites are confronted with meaningful challenges to their power, like Brexit, Trump, the mid-2010s leftward turn in a number of European countries like Greece, Spain, the UK, etc. Moreover, and this is also important, the disinformation, the so-called disinformation experts, for whom this is a job description, typically participate in the production of disinformation. Consider, for example, the COVID lab leak theory. In 2020 and 21, Facebook, bowing to pressures from the nascent censorship industrial complex, flagged as disinformation and later blocked reports that the pandemic was the outcome of coronavirus leaking from a lab in the Chinese city of Wuhan. These suggestions were backed up by serious journalistic work and also independent experts. Remember, this lab was undertaking so-called gain of function research in order to create more infectious variants of the virus. Nonetheless, Facebook blocked this information for a very long period. And today, the official position of, for example, the US Department of Energy and also of the FBI is that the lab leak theory is in fact the plausible one. Now, next slide. To counter disinformation in this trend toward censorship, I would propose that social scientists, including those in our field, relational sociology, should do more public sociology, that is scholarly work that's nonetheless aimed at a wider audience. Doing public sociology means also participating in the public sphere, of course, not by becoming kind of intellectual celebrities, but by bringing our relational thinking to public debates on current affairs, especially those where substantialist thinking plays a role in aggravating or even creating crises and conflicts. Now, my illustration, the ongoing Israel-Gaza war. So there's no shortage of excellent scholarly work on this conflict written in accessible prose. Also, a lot of academics in this field do go on mainstream media. Having said that, there are still aspects of this conflict that are virtually absent from even the most elaborate criticism of the policies that have led to this conflict. And one such aspect, I think crucial, is that the blockade of the Gaza Strip in place since 2007 constitutes an act of aggression. And that's because under international law, a blockade is an act of war. Just compare the blockade of Gaza on the left with the Six-Day War, the map here on the right, in 1967, which was triggered by the Egyptian militarist blockade of the Straits of Tiran, here in the south, to which the Israeli Defense Forces responded by a successful strike, lifting the blockade. The upshot is that blockaded populations have the right to use military force in order to lift the blockade, just like the IDF had this right and did it in 1967 with regard to the Straits of Tiran. That was legitimate. Of course, the ensuing occupation of the Sinai, the West Bank, Gaza, the Golan, etc. was not. Now, this does not mean that blockaded populations, paramilitaries among them, or the military have the right to attack civilians. Clearly, they do not. This would constitute an act of terror, also prohibited under international law. So the series of attacks started by Hamas in October this year clearly do not fall in the category of legitimate self-defense. The Hamas militants wanted to kill Israelis, and they wanted to continue, and they still want to continue to terrorize the population. Now, this should not occult the fact that the population of the Gaza Strip has the right to do what is permitted under international law to end the blockade of their territory, including the legitimate use of force. I'm bringing this up because this specific aspect of the conflict is almost never discussed in the media, not even in nuanced critiques. My suggestion is that this is because the substantialist view that Arabs and Muslims are prone to violence permeates even those sectors of public discourse that aim to defend these groups against racialized stereotypes. In such a context, the proposition that Gazans have the right to use legitimate force to end the blockade would come across as accommodating, or worse, advocating terrorism. So in other words, it is only by tacitly accepting the thesis of Arab Muslim predisposition to violence that defending Gazans' right to self-defense in line with international law becomes unthinkable, even for criticism of relevant Israel policies. Further illustration. Remember, in contexts where rights matter, racialized people are effaced. Their rights are not likely to get attention precisely because they are racialized, less human. In fact, in racialized discourse, they don't even qualify as civilians. To illustrate this point further, I'm going to play a clip from the press conference of Israel's president, Yitzhak Herzog. That's October 14th, a week after Hamas launched this wave of terror attacks in southern Israel. And I hope the audio will be okay. Can you see my my video player, or is it only the is it my slides or the video player?
Your slides right now.
Still my slides?
Yeah.
Oh.
Maybe exit full screen or minimize. Or did you only share the PDF Adobe?
It was not possible to share my entire desktop, so I need to play this clip, whatever it takes. Stop sharing, okay, and come back to the sharing mode again. Share screen and President Herzog. Okay. Now, can you see my video?
Yes. Now, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And also hear the sound check.
Tells it all.
Yeah.
President Herzog, Ragio.
Yeah.
Okay. So, yeah.
From ITV News in the United Kingdom. You spoke very passionately about saying that Israel was not retaliating but targeting with regard to the operations in Gaza. But even President Biden, who spoke so personally and passionately with regard to what was happening in Gaza, spoke about the importance of the laws of war and the humanitarian situation within Gaza. So with that in mind, what can Israel do to alleviate the impact of this conflict on 2 million civilians, many of whom have nothing to do with Hamas?
First of all, we have to understand there's a state in a way that has built a machine of evil right at our doorstep. It's an entire nation out there that is responsible. It's not true. This rhetoric about civilians not aware, not involved, it's absolutely not true. They could have risen up, they could have fought against that evil regime which took over Gaza in a coup d'etat, murdering their family members who were in Fatah. There's a short memory in the world. Israel evacuated Gaza unilaterally in order to show that it's willing to make peace. I was a member of that cabinet.
I'm going to stop sharing the screen. I think you get my point. And returning to the slides. My slides are up again.
Yes.
Can you see them?
Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, I have a couple of more things to say. So again, to the question on the journalist's question on the handling of civilians who are not responsible for terrorist attacks by Hamas, the president goes, quote, "It's an entire nation responsible." It's not true. This rhetoric about civilians not aware, not involved is absolutely not true. They could have risen up. They could have fought against that evil regime which took over Gaza in a coup d'etat, unquote. Remember, this is the same rhetoric that Hamas has been using to justify its attacks on Israeli civilians. In their minds, I mean, in the Hamas mind, Israel's citizens are collectively responsible for those actions of the government that harm Palestinians. By the way, Osama bin Laden also used this exact same rhetoric. So the remarks by Israel's president just played constitute disinformation, and that's putting it mildly. Yet, under the influence of the current disinformation moral panic, merely pointing this out and adding that this is a call for collective punishment, no less, and not unlike calls by terrorists like Hamas, is extremely difficult in the public sphere. Now, there's no denying that in the wake of this new war in the Middle East, comparable racialized and dehumanizing rhetoric against Jews is also on the rise. Obviously, those sectors of the media that are insensitive to the suffering of the Israeli population under terrorist attack are committing the same error of omission as those that are incapable of contextualizing the Palestinian issue with regard to international law. And finally, to wrap up, the challenge is tremendous. Try as a relationally minded public sociologist to weigh in on discussions to which participants of authority are bringing their substantialist flavored conventional wisdoms. How do you elaborate on that set of human rights that even critics of racialized thinking fail to bring up precisely because it's unthinkable that they do so? So I have no answer. I only wonder. So thank you for your attention. Back to Kevin.
Thank you, Zoltan. Okay, so as the final point here, I am going to take the conversation to a much broader. So I'm not a media analysis expert. I'm not in media studies. My sort of point of view is much more in the philosophy of education, philosophy of science, and the idea that, to me, in our title this week, we have reflexivity versus objectivity, and how to critically assess knowledge in an era of fake news. And the part that really interested me in this title was the reflexivity and objectivity question. And I think that it's it very intimately connects with the questions that Zoltan's speaking about, and the problem of thinking the unthinkable. And so I actually haven't prepared slides. I wanted to sort of come at this with general comments and conversations, and then hopefully lead that into an open discussion that everyone can engage in. And I think that when we talk about the concept of objectivity, the concept itself is one that has a lot of problems. And I think the problem in the simplest of senses is actually in the word objectivity. We have object as the way of thinking of guaranteed, assured, solid understanding knowledge. And so science in the modern world is very much bound up with object-oriented or substance-based argumentation. And the way we think about reliability, the way we think about trustworthiness, the way we think about universalized knowledge ends up leading us towards the desire to take away the relational, to take away the processual, because that's the way science ends up and has been defined for a very long time. And so I think a lot of the work that I've done is about this way of thinking about objectivity in modernity and the modernist context. And this desire for us to create a fixed, stable world that we can know in an absolute and total sense. And in the philosophy of science, this has always been a major debate, one of the huge ones. And so how do we find objectivity? How do we find a way to access the world where we remove any doubt, any uncertainty, in a way, that's what objectivity often means in our language, in our discourse, and in our institutions. And we see it at every level of the way most of our institutions are organized. So I am in the Faculty of Educational Science at Université Laval in Quebec. And I think a lot of the time when we use the word science in this context, it actually means unhumanized. It means unperspective. It means we want the scientific understanding of social or educational processes, and oftentimes it ends up being, and then we end up with lots of debates in this vein around. And Florian and I were going to talk yesterday, where this was the main conversation, debates around are ethnographic methods scientific, because they imply participation, they imply engagement, they imply all of these things that seem to be non-scientific, and so we end up with this confrontation that we're always basically working through in an objective-oriented culture. And basically, if I wanted to simplify exactly my argument today, is that I think that this version of objectivity, which is so central to not just science, but the way we think about real knowledge in the media, the way we think about, I think it is ultimately a false comfort that we have relied upon in the sciences. And that false comfort is something that today in the world, we are constantly running into its limitations to describe, understand, explain the complexity, the messy aspects of how the world actually works, how the problems in the world actually works. We want objective truth. We want objective access to, and I think this Israel-Hamas is actually a very good example of specifically, we wish that there could be a perfect point of view to stand outside of this problem and say that this problem is easily resolvable from an objective point of view. But the world does not work that way, because the world is a complex place with relational dynamics that make it complex, and depending on where you're standing, those dynamics make complexity into something that we have to contend with. And so I think that in order to have this conversation at some level that Zoltan is inviting us towards, the public intellectual, the public sociology, where we're intervening and we're critiquing, I think one of the things that we have to contend with is, what do we mean by objectivity, and what do we desire out of our engagement in the public sphere? Are we trying to contribute to a discourse of absolute certainty around complexity, around political problems? Are we trying to contribute to a dialogue that is inclusive of all of the different perspectives, which is a challenging, so inclusive points of views end up requiring us to think of objectivity not as a single point, but as something else. And so I wanted to maybe give some suggestions of different points of view of how we might think of objectivity in a different way. And so one other point about the idea of objectivity that I think is important to, and this is sort of, I'm kind of relying here on some of the sociological work of Jeffrey Alexander, who is a cultural sociologist. And Jeffrey Alexander talks about that modernity is basically connected to this idea of the dream of reason, Our cultures have been defined around this desire to perfectly order the world through reason, rationality. The university as an institution takes that idea to heart, and it ends up always creating this this tension between reason and unreason, rationality and irrationality. And we want everything to be perfectly rational, and we want it to be scientific. And I think that this connects back to Melody's analysis. We end up creating these binaries where if it's not rational, it's irrational. If it's not, and we get stuck in these ways of thinking. And this is very much a product of the object-oriented, the substantialist-oriented way of thinking. And I think that oftentimes the reason we want everything to be reasonable, and I'm taking a big leap here. This is, but I think oftentimes this desire for reason is also based in a desire for power. When we can explain things, we can control things. When we can explain them properly, we can remove doubt. We can remove uncertainty, and in removing uncertainty and doubt, we can act on them, and we can make things out of them. And so there is a kind of a capitalist dimension here too, where we want to produce. And we want universities to produce, and we want things to be productive. And so there's this desire to control for the sake of all kinds of different reasons. And so in a sense, my argument today and my invitation to thought here is to think about what a relational approach to objectivity does to all of these different problems. How do we relinquish that control in the name of a more complex, more messy, less certain version of the reality we face? And that reality is one that we live with every day. We just live with it, I think, in a state of discomfort. So the Gaza-Israel example is, I think, a perfect one. It is very uncomfortable. And it is one where we're constantly trying to impose some other version of perfect, this is why. And usually it's power related. It's related to what is the interest of the given country, United States, and its relationship with Israel, for example, or things of that kind. And so for myself, I think one of the where I come around here is I tend to adopt an approach around objectivity, around that comes from maybe Charles Sanders Peirce, or the pragmatist point of view. And for Peirce, objectivity is not about knowing reality from the outside. He calls it intersubjective agreement. And so we're kind of thrown into a conversation about how can we develop a community of discourse that is not exclusive, that isn't about controlling or creating a single way of understanding the world, but that invites ambiguity, complexity. And I think in that sense, this is probably the point that really connects all three of our interventions. Like, how do we find a way of thinking about the world that really gives the process and the relational its proper place, and that we are not so much concerned with fixing everything in a final state. And yeah, that's the part that I wanted to contribute, and so this sort of engages, I think, with very key ideas of objectivity, and I think that reflexivity is a central part of how we do this. We being reflexive, considering our position, considering our relationships, considering our role in the social system, and is an important part of how we might participate as academics, scholars, thinkers in this key problem. And yeah, so we can maybe open that up. I know that Melody had prepared some questions, and maybe we could share those.
While you do that, Kevin, thank you so much for both of you, and also to Melody for her sending her slides, and also sending really suggestive points to consider in this discussion. I wonder if people would like to raise your virtual hands or your physical hand in case you want to make a comment. I don't know, Kevin, were you gonna share that slide from Melody? And then maybe in the meantime, I have two hands. I have Jenna Woodruff's hand. She's and then we have Chris as well in the lineup for speakers for now. There we go.
Good morning, everyone. What a nice way to wake up for me to have this intersection of three speakers. I just wanted to jump in, I guess, first, because what I wanted to contribute to the discussion dovetails so nicely with the last piece of conversation. So just for a very tiny bit of context, I am a philosopher in my areas in epistemic justice. And my training is in feminist neo-pragmatist approaches to epistemic justice. And so I wanted to jump right onto that Charles Saunders Peirce approach and offer a contextual alternative that takes its roots. It's a neo-pragmatist approach, but it really does center that relational approach to objectivity. And it also wants to do away with the binary that's at the heart of so many of the subjectivist approaches to knowledge and objectivity. And so the person I wanted to bring onto stage, as it were, is Helen Longino, and she is a feminist neo-pragmatist. And she has a take that starts off with Peirce's alternate of intersubjective agreement, but she characterizes that as the justification element of knowledge. So lots of philosophers have this tripartite conception of truth tripartite conception of knowledge, where knowledge has to do with three intersecting things: a belief element, a truth or truthy element, and a justification element. And so Longino takes the Peircean intersubjective agreement as the justification requirement, but she adds a whole bunch of really important things for justice in knowledge. So intersubjective agreement can't be power-based or hierarchically based. It has to be intersubjective agreement within communities that are egalitarian, and where all the participants achieve that agreement with equality of voice and equality of epistemic authority. So it builds a whole bunch of justice into this justification requirement that Peirce had ostended towards back in the day. But then she also contributes this really cool alternative to the truth element, which in early modern discourse in philosophy, the truth element was binary. It's a correspondence theory. Either it agrees with the object or it disagrees with the object. And then there's coherence theory, where truth has to cohere. Well, what Longino contributes and other feminist epistemic justice advocates is this alternative that she calls isomorphism. And isomorphism is not binary in any way, stretch of the imagination. Isomorphism is fundamentally pragmatic in that it has to do with our ability to navigate our environments, our social environments, as well as our physical environments, with our particular ends or our particular goals in mind. So something is isomorphic or truthy if, by using the model or the concept or the construct, we're able to achieve our ends or our objectives in that either physical or social world. So So we've got the truthy element, and then the justification element, and then the belief element is more model theoretic than belief, because again, belief is so often, at least in the English language, connected up with that substantivist ideology. A belief is true, like snow is white, if and only if snow is white. By contrast, we shift the perspective away from semantics and into this much more multiple dimensioned approach where it's modeled, which I think is a lot more sensitive and a lot more nuanced. It's not binary, and it accounts for the different kinds of relationships that we can look at when we're looking at belief type of things. So I just had to jump in at the tail end, because I absolutely agree that this kind of pragmatist approach that Peirce articulated is a way out of the binary thinking. But I wanted to kind of advance Longino's view because of those justice elements and the isomorphism element. Thanks, folks.
Thank you so much, Jenna, for that contribution. Really, really rich, really enriching our discussion here today. And next in line is Christopher, and then Jonathan.
Thank you. Thanks, Monica, and thanks to Kevin and Zoltan for opening us up here. I have so many questions. I'll just stick to two. One is very briefly, I want to say, I like how the concept of intersubjectivity takes us in a relational dialogic process direction. But I have this question, what about the non-humans? Isn't intersubjectivity kind of anthropocentric? And isn't it kind of idealist a little bit? Like, what about the way the material world pushes back when I bang into a lamp that I didn't know was there on the street or whatever? Like force, compulsion, like how do we incorporate that into our conceptualization? So just to leave that hanging. But I want to ask a question of Zoltan. And my question is kind of like, so I personally agree with everything you've said about Israel and Hamas. That aligns with my political view of the situation. So I'm not questioning any of that. Question I want to ask is what's relational about the account that you present? So I could imagine, for instance, Noam Chomsky saying everything that you just said. And Chomsky is very much a substantialist. He believes that there's an objective material world. He believes, in fact, that moral truths are objective. He's said so. And in your account, you appeal to things that could be considered objective, historical facts, international law, and also the concept of humanity, which we could take as a substantialist idea, that you're talking about dehumanization. It's implying there's such a thing as humanity. So the question that I have then is what is relational about the critical account of the Palestinian situation that you presented?
Kevin, do you go first, or?
Would you like to respond to that, Zoltan?
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, Zoltan, you go first. Yeah, I think it's
bearing in mind the other one. What about the non-humans also? That which I also find quite suggestive. Go on.
Yeah, thank you for raising this idea, because I agree that based on my 10 minutes plus presentation, it's kind of very reminiscent of the type of critique that Noam Chomsky and others have been producing over the course of the last decade. Speaking of the Israel-Palestine conflict, what I would propose that this account, the way that this account is different from the Chomskyan line of thought, the school of thought, even in international relations, that it's not the monocausal view of the conflict. It's not that linear. To give you an illustration, I am teaching a master's class on the political economy of the media, where the media coverage of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is one among 4 case studies. And this class of mine coincides, the related lectures coincide with the onset of the most recent conflict. And I had as a guest speaker to my class, actually 2 days ago, this Wednesday, an ex-friend of mine from my university years, who with his family made Aliyah. So they, Hungarian Jew with his family immigrating to Israel, and they were granted citizenship, within a very, very short, relatively quickly. And he is more or less of the same view as I am. And he said in front of the class the following: there are no winners and losers in this conflict, and there is not one party who is which is primarily responsible for the outbreak of the conflict, going back to the 1930s or even earlier, with the arrival, with the influx of the first sizable chunks of immigrants from Europe to what was then British Mandate of Palestine. And there is no clear resolution of the conflict either. You cannot blame one party more for the, even for the most recent escalation of the conflict. Of course, the successive Israeli government's policies in order to uphold the occupation and not lift the blockade of the Gaza Strip are responsible, but it's not monocausal, it's not linear. So the way I would differentiate my thinking regarding this conflict from Chomsky's take is that it's much less monocausal, and it's especially not linear. Okay, does this answer your question?
That's an interesting thing, isn't it? Like that, if we think that there's a single cause, a monocausal analysis, then we think we know what the solution of the problem is, and that's what Israel's trying to do, saying this is the Palestinians' fault, they're the cause of it, they're the ones who have to change. And if we look at it relationally, we see a reciprocal flow, we say no discrete cause, and that's a little different from saying Israel's the cause, which is a position that critical thinkers are taking. So then it raises this question of what do you do? How do you intervene? How do you change the dynamic and the flow? Am I right? Is this kind of...
Yeah. Oh, that's fantastic. What I was saying. The challenge is tremendous. Speaking of, the public sociologist's role when it comes to making sense of the conflict, but also in international relations, when it comes to diplomacy, the challenge is tremendous. Detaching oneself from the monocausal linear view of the conflict, which is very often the way a lot of historians approach the conflict, the linear monocausal sequential view.
Yeah, and the challenging thing, is that in a complex system where there's multiple reciprocal flows, you can always construct a linear monocausal account if you want to, by focusing on certain facts and certain chains of events, but that's always going to be inadequate. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. This is a really interesting discussion. We also have Jonathan in the lineup for talking right now, and I put myself in the speakers list. Go on, Jonathan.
First of all, thank you, Zoltan and Kevin, and Melody as well. Okay, I also had many questions, but I guess I'll focus on one right now, which is inspired by Kevin, but also I think that everyone should kind of think about this. For a moment, you kind of spoke about a possible connection between explanation and power, or why we're interested in these kinds of explanations, because you connected it to kind of a capitalist logic. Maybe that's true. I know there's quite a lot of work even by psychologists about why people ask why questions and how explanation works in like everyday practice. And well, of course, explanation is so valuable precisely because it allows us to imagine how the world could be different. So philosophers of science often speak about like difference making. We have an explanation if, we know if you change, one place of the world, how it is dependent on everything else. So you can, you imagine what the world how it would be different if we changed something. And for the purpose of politics, that's incredibly important. And that's one of the reasons any kind of critical or emancipatory social science should be very interested in explanations, because we want to make the world different, and for that to be possible, we need to kind of know where we need to intervene. So I would, okay, let's accept that and embrace it rather than putting away the political moment. Maybe our explanations are somehow influenced by power. I mean, yeah, let's accept that. First of all, we want explanations because we want to make the world a better place. But when it comes to objectivity, I don't know. I agree with this kind of pragmatist or intersubjective view. There's quite a large literature on objectivity as kind of a practice within a social, scientific community. It's not about, do we correspond to the world as it is, but it's the question of how do we get this kind of intersubjective agreement that we need if we're going to change the world, if we can get this movement going. Well, that's still not within the context of relational sociology. That is the open question that I don't, anyway, I guess my point here is that let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater either. I think there are a lot of scientific virtues that in any discipline that are worth preserving, even if we recognize all the background. So yeah, I don't have any good solutions to offer here, but I guess the point is, yeah, we can understand objectivity as this relational process within a certain community and so forth, but the question is still open. Like, what does that process of coming to some sort of intersubjective agreement, how it's temporary, it's, of course, it has to be in our worldview, but that's still the big question. How are we going to build a body of knowledge, however temporary, so that we can actually enact change? Yeah, thank you.
Absolutely. So I have lots that I would like to respond actually in relation to that. And I agree very much with, and I also understand I understand the spirit of what you're saying. I would counter though with the idea that the fact of needing to explain, needing to act upon the world, needing to make plans for is not the same thing, and it's often what is conflated with explanation. Yeah, it's different from power and the way that we organize society based on norms that are. And so, for example, to critique the idea that this desire to explain, describe, understand is linked to power. So there's an issue that needs to be put at the forefront here, which is that what role does reason play in our society? Like, actually, what actual role does it play? So we think of reason as this perfect thing. And the story that I'm telling is basically that reason is another meta-narrative, as other meta-narratives existed in the past. So, and this is actually the big challenge with modernity. Modernity is based on a false origin story. We have created a rupture and a break. And this rupture with our history is one that gives us now the perfect ability to reorganize society around science and technocracy. And so we live in a technocracy that comes from this original break. And we live with a sense of self as modern people that relies on this meta-narrative of like, yes, this is, and there are a lot of things that come from that. A lot of falsehoods come out of that. And some of the major ones are the falsehoods around power, right? So Canada is a good example. Canada is a country that is peacekeepers, and so there's this notion of national identity where our nation is one that we don't look at how our identity is actually erasing all kinds of relations of power that are much more real in our national context, but that we cover over because we have this meta-narrative of like, we are a modern country as among modern countries. And so I think that the reason it's important to confront these ways of thinking, it's not to just to abandon the idea of explaining and explanatory planning. It's to abandon the idea that such explanations actually have objective merit, objective status, in the sense that they are unchallengeable or and what we end up with then is we end up with having to have a much more serious and complicated conversation. And I think in a way that actually gets us partway to the solution that is needed, which is how do we invite people to develop the critical capacities, to just accept that the world that we live in is not going to be the cleanest world that we all grow up thinking that we should have, and that we're all like, and I think that we see this in the media today where there's this, Zoltan actually mentioned moral panic around all of these different things. I think that moral panic is an expression of what we believe in the first place, which is that we can have a perfectly clean and orderly society. And when we don't have that, we're like, and then people sort of jump out of the public sphere and revert to. So I think that these are also expressions of a binary way of thinking. Yeah, and then I don't know if the idea that there was a question that Chris brought up about the non-human, and I'll just say that to that, for me, my response to that is absolutely, I completely agree. My actual I used, I think, the Persian model because it's kind of a very simple model that sort of gives a sort of in a 5-minute thing. But actually, I think there is a version of how we think about this intersubjective process where it's much more about like shifting configuration. So my research used Karen Barrett's agential realism approach, the idea that there are material, non-material, sort of interactive phenomena that come into formation and just disassemble, and those things can apply to different networks, they can apply to nations, they can apply to all kinds of different, and so it's a very complex. And so I absolutely think that getting to a place where we think of whatever it might be, truth or objectivity, as a momentary sort of network, constellation, agreement that will sort of disassemble is also necessarily important. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I am this is such great, rich discussion. I put myself in the speakers lists and it's my turn now. So I would just wanted to contribute to the discussion around intersubjectivity and how that is, yes, temporary, and the importance of explanation to change the world, and also the kinds of biases and falsehoods as well that Kevin mentions associated to modernity. I would like to bring the conversation back to part of the title of today's topic, which is reflexivity. And so reflexivity and situatedness. And I would like to say my own situatedness as a racialized woman is to always think about the coloniality embedded there in all these things that we discuss when we talk about modernity. Enrique Dussel and Aníbal Quijano talk about the coloniality, the modernity coloniality thing, that it's a whole. It's not just, we're not just modern. There's also this colonial underbelly that is the one that racializes and others and looks at, right, at specific groups of people in certain ways, like Zoltan has mentioned with respect to racialization of Arabs and Muslims, but also, for example, Melody discussing the other in terms of the extremist and radicalized participants in odious projects, that it's just so easy to say, well, they're irrational and they don't make sense in those binaries. So that reflexivity, I think, is so important in terms of looking at those intersubjectivities, but also that the justice part that Jenna was referring to, right? Intersubjectivity among who is involved in that group, and why do they have the power to say what is the explanation that applies here? And then going back to the non-human part, I think we should also pause and think about different ways of knowing beyond that modernity coloniality whole. And in that, I think indigenous ways of knowing have a lot to tell us about the role of the non-human, a lot to teach us about that in terms of looking at the, the agency of the elements that surround us and on which we depend to live. And it's not only those living entities, animals or plants, but even thinking about the environment in which we live. So all of this, I think, I guess, poses more questions than answers them. But that part, the reflexivity part, I wonder if anyone has anything to say. I'm seeing we have like 15 minutes left in our session here today. But if you would like to address those points, that would be amazing. And I see Chris has his hand up. So
Yeah, if I may, unless someone else wants to jump in, but I'm all excited. Because I feel like Foucault has kind of gone before us a bit in some of the questions that we're talking about. We're talking about reason, for instance, and I remember him making a point about shifting from reason to rationalities, that, Weber describes rationality as basically like self-consistency. And I think other philosophers would as well. And so you see historically these projects to make power and discourse work together in a self-consistent way, and there are these multiple different ways that this gets done. So we see these multiple rationalities throughout even just like modern history, and those rationalities emanate from particular networks of people who are engaged in particular social projects, and that's where we can bring the reflexivity into it. Like, I think we might agree that to speak very broadly, like the notion of objectivity that we're using as a foil owes a lot to an Enlightenment kind of liberalism produced by white bourgeois European men who wanted to articulate like a political theory that could claim universality, and they did so by shifting the basis of universality from God to the human subject, but not to a social interdependent human subject, but to an abstracted independent human subject. And in doing so, what they did is they erased from view their own class domination, their gender domination, their racial domination, the colonial domination, all these relations of domination on which their social existence depended. And so as scholar activists committed to transforming these relations and unmaking, patriarchy and colonialism and so on, we're reframing. And so that's our reflexivity, is that our motivation for redrawing the conceptual boundaries comes from these concrete political commitments that we're invested in. So we're not any more universal than anyone else, but we can articulate what it is that we're doing and why. How does that sound as a starter?
Looks good. Zoltan.
Still harking back to Chomsky. Speaking of the specifics of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, or his view of international relationships in general, there's one aspect of his work which I guess that can be salvaged for the purpose of relational sociology in the following way. He uses the expression built-in assumptions as behind the media bias, but he never actually gets to explain what built-in assumptions mean. And I guess that if Chomsky had ever set out to explore what built-in assumptions mean in practice, in a process, then he would have ended up with a more relational view of not only international politics, my main point is going to be of linguistics, because the Chomskyan view of linguistic competence is based on the assumption that, you know, there's the fully competent speaker, everyone's fully competent, and it's very code and algorithm based. And speaking of the difficulty of acquiring of learning a language past childhood, he always comes up with you know, propositions like you know, the linguistic competence is a very special things, it wears off at later stages in life. Well, when again, if he had ever set out to explore what built-in assumptions mean, then he would come across the bodily aspect, the bodily, the performative, the ritual, the bodily ritualistic aspect of linguistic competence. And it's muscular, you know, it's never purely, and it's primarily not intellectual, the way he conceives of linguistic competence. So Bourdieu's work in, I guess, in speaking of linguistic capital linguistic competence from the early 80s is excellent, and it's also translated to English, because it emphasizes the bodily part, the bodily aspect, the environmental affordance-based aspect of learning anything, you know, a language to begin with. Thank you.
Thank you, Zoltan. I see Kevin's hand up, and yeah, go on, Kevin. Take it.
Thank you. I don't want to take up too much space if there was other. I wanted to maybe just comment on the question of reflexivity as well. I didn't really engage too much into it because I didn't want to make the part that I had developed too long. But for me, I think in some respects, the question of reflexivity is the whole question of how do we engage in complex worlds without falling back on the desire to have perfect objective status and reality. I think in some respects, it comes down to a question of how do we organize what it means. My response to this question has, from a long time now, been based in education. And this is in a way why I'm in the field of education, because I feel like the question of reflexivity, and I guess it depends on which definition of reflexivity we're drawing on. If we're going towards Bourdieu, for example, Bourdieu's view of reflexivity is very sort of scientific tool oriented. We need to use the tools of science to extract ourselves from our situation. And that's one view of objectivity. The more common usage of reflexivity is basically that, you know, we sort of leverage our networks to sort of understand ourselves better, and it's a much softer idea of what we mean by reflexivity. But I feel like in the space of education, it should be the space where both we get the content knowledge we need to get, but we also need, I think, the opportunities to engage in self-analysis and analysis of our society through ourselves. And I think that one of the reasons we have maybe so little of that goes a little bit back to the question of, I think, how education tends to be overly organized around the instrumental outcomes that we want from education, which we want, for example, people to be trained, we want them to be ready for a job market, but we don't necessarily think as much, and in a sense, we're actually removing the dimension of a lot of schooling where we want people to be ready to live in a world that is messy and very, very messy. And so this is not just in lower levels, elementary school, high school. In the university, this is ever more the case. I was at the University of Toronto during my master's and my PhD, and while I was there, Boise, it's kind of like the center of a kind of critical educational work. They closed both their Center for Ethics and their Philosophy of Education program while I was there. And I was in the Philosophy of Education program, and so we ended up moving into the sociology at the students that were remaining, but there were no longer any students being admitted in that field. And I think that this is in large part because these are hard to market. And so there's a kind of an argument that can be made that these fields are more important than in a way that they've ever been, given the complexity we face in the world, and they're also less valued than they've ever been. because we want more concrete outcomes out of our education. So, yeah.
Thank you so much for those comments, Kevin. And I wonder, we still have a few minutes left. I wonder if there's anything else, any more remarks anyone would like to offer on today's topic. Lots of food for thought, lots of things to think about, and to also remind everyone that our next session is December 15, and I will be sending those details. I see a hand up. Jenna, would you like to?
Yeah, again, just thank you to you, Monica, so much for your such strong and I guess odious work preparing the SSHRC application. I just think that's such a burden that you've undertaken for all of us. So I just wanted to take a quick moment to acknowledge that labor and to thank you and everyone for bringing us all together around this really important conversation this morning. That's all I wanted to say.
Thank you so much. I will stop the recording and then we can say bye-bye.